Hello and welcome on this early spring Sunday afternoon. I am Humphrey Hawksley, and this is a hybrid event with the two spheres of an empire. The Goldster magazine show, that is a conversation between civilians within a community, meets Care Vision's professional talks, where specialist peer groups discuss issues on health and social care that are critical to all our lives. My guest today is the preeminent expert in that balance between the two spheres of our brain. He is a psychiatrist, a pioneer in the way we think, why we think, who we think we are, and why we understand our place in the world. And in your newspapers today, his thoughts cover a huge spread in the Sunday Express, the West facing a collapse akin to that of the Roman Empire. Politics and all the rest of it might have a part to play, but one of the root truths is how our brains work, balancing the two spheres on the right and the left. And before I say any more and put my foot in it, welcome, Dr. Iain McGilchrist.
Oh, thank you very much, Humphrey. Lovely to be with you again. So, yes.
It's great. I wonder, the Sunday Express talks about the apparently logical left hemisphere of the brain working at the expense of the more flexible right. Just encapsulate all of that in a nutshell for us.
Okay. Well, the key word there is apparently. Right. There's been a lot of talk about hemisphere differences since about the 1960s and 70s. And almost all of it is basically wrong when you come to look at it. So I'd ask anybody who's relying on what they think they know about the hemisphere differences to put it out of their mind. I spent a lot of time looking at this question, about 30 years, and researching on it. And the question that set me going was, why is the brain divided at all? I mean, after all, the brain's power comes from making connections. Why should it be divided? And it's not just our brains, it's all the brains of every creature we've looked at. Where they have a brain, it's divided. And then there's the question of asymmetry in the brain. Why is certainly the human brain asymmetrical? If you just wanted more room, why not just do it symmetrically? The world's symmetrical, why do it that way? And the third question was, why is the connection between the two hemispheres, a band of fibers at the base, known as the corpus callosum, why is it a lot about inhibiting the other hemisphere? So it's not about it is about transmitting, it is about facilitating, but often the message is, I'm going to deal with this, or you're going to deal with it. So there's something about these hemispheres that suggests they have to be different. They're physically separated, they're asymmetrical, and the connections often say, no, I'll do it, not you. What is all this about? And it seems that the answer is about a very important question, and that all creatures have to resolve if they're going to survive, which is, how do they get what they need, principally food, but grabbing or getting anything that they want to use, like a twig to build a nest or whatever? How do they balance that very specially targeted attention to something they already know what it is, they know they want it, they want to get it quickly and grab it, quick and dirty? That is the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere, meantime, is doing a completely different kind of job, which is looking out for literally everything else other than that morsel you're trying to grab. So it's looking out for predators, it's looking out for your kin, for your mate, for your offspring. It's seeing the whole picture, because if you don't have that, while you're getting your lunch, you quickly become somebody else's. So this is necessary for all creatures to survive. And the essential difference for today, I suppose, is why is it important about this difference? Well, first of all, from a point of view of understanding the brain, it's important because the way you attend changes what you find in the world. So if you go to the world with certain preconceptions of what you want, you only see the thing you want and the thing you know that is there. And there are many amusing experiments that have been set up by clever psychologists where something colossally important happens in the middle of your field of vision and you don't even see it because you're not expecting to see it. So that's important, and this attention changes the quality of the world. So one field that is actually in the right field of vision, because in the brain the right hand side of space is dealt with by the left hemisphere and the left side by the right hemisphere. So in the right hemispace, the left hemisphere space, it sees a world which is made up of fragments, that are static, isolated, decontextualized, abstracted, non-unique, and basically inanimate. And the right hemisphere, meanwhile, is seeing a world where nothing is finally certain and fixed, where everything is interconnected ultimately, where everything is flowing and changing, where what matters is not the explicit often, but what is not being said or is not immediately obvious, the implicit, which is the power of many of the things, most of the things that we really love and get our sense of life from, things like love and religious faith and art and music and poetry and myth and all the things that help us understand the world. So these are two quite different worlds, one inanimate, fixed, mechanical, made up of bits, the other a flowing organism that is not reducible in that way and is fundamentally alive.
Well, I mean, I have got so many questions to pick up on that, but I'm going to say to our audience of both spheres of the Care Visions empire, that's the experts of the brain who are with us and the civilians of the community, comment and question in the chat. One of my rules as a journalist is that the only stupid question is the one you never ask. One of Iain's is that when there are things we can't question, we live in a tyranny. Test us. Take us off our feet and take my carefully planned quizzing of Iain McGilchrist in a direction that neither of us had imagined. What you were describing there, Iain, if I'm right, is that we have two entities, spheres or two personalities possibly that are having to work together, and that there is a link between them where they exchange information but somehow withhold it. A little bit like a marriage or any business partnership.
Yes, I mean that's right. Yes.
So what I'd like to do is begin in our own community, in our own society at the moment, where there is a lot of talk about heightened anxiety, self-esteem, which is where people are grasping for their relevance and place in the world. And I think you wrote somewhere that that people are in a permanent state of unfulfilled desire. Which part of the brain is pushing that?
Very much the left hemisphere. But to explain that, I have to caution that over history, the brain, obviously like everything in the body, evolves a little bit. But I'm not talking about historical changes in the brain. It's more historical changes in the way we use the brain. So an analogy would be like you've got a new radio set and you begin by listening to a couple of channels. After a while, you find you're only really listening to one channel. Now, civilizations broadly, and this is something I trace in the Master and his Emissary, seem to begin with a very good balance in the way they think about the world between what the left and right hemisphere can offer. This is very rich and fruitful. But as time goes on, each of these civilizations drifts further and further to the mode of the left hemisphere, and then it collapses. And the left hemisphere, I think it's important to say this, is basically much more open to being deluded. I have an amusing chapter in The Matter with Things in which I look at some of the, say, 30 neuropsychiatric syndromes in which people are completely deluded, and they are fascinating. But almost every single one, with one exception, is due to the right hemisphere being somehow dysfunctional or not working properly. So the left hemisphere left to itself is not what people used to say the rational, intelligent, reliable one, even if a bit boring. It's actually hot-headed. It tends to jump to conclusions more than the right hemisphere. It has to have black and white answers to everything. There's no room for nuance. And as cultures evolve, they tend to get bigger. And as they get bigger, they need to control more. And it's about power. If you want to be able to control a large territory, in whatever means, militarily or probably in modern terms more likely economically, the thing is you have to roll out a certain way of thinking which cuts out all the human, the nuance, the stuff that makes life worth living, and reduces everything to a schema, an algorithm. And it's like believing that the map that you've got, which is very simple in relation to the world that it maps, is the real world. And so I think that's the kind of world we're in now. And if I just quickly take that on to the question that you asked about why we're so unfulfilled. The left hemisphere doesn't understand any of the things that really make us fulfilled and happy as human beings. It discounts them. It thinks they have no reality. What it is concerned with is only utility and power. Now, those are very important in the struggle for survival. You need something that's looking out for power and utility, but you desperately need it to be under the guidance of something that sees much more, is much wiser, and that is the master. In my metaphor of the master from the hemisphere. The hemisphere is the left hemisphere. It's a perfectly good functionary who does useful stuff as long as it sticks to what it's competent at, which is low-level bureaucracy. But it doesn't understand the picture. So all around the world, you find there are myths about two figures that struggle. One of them is why it is like a Buddha figure or almost a godlike figure in reason. And there's a hot-headed upstart who thinks he knows everything. And like people who think they know everything, he's actually rather stupid.
That's your left hemisphere,
That's
is it?
your left hemisphere.
So yeah. When you think, maybe I shouldn't blurt this out, maybe I shouldn't do that, that's your left hemisphere pushing. But tell me,
when you say maybe I shouldn't, that's the right hemisphere saying, hang on, mate, there may be more to this than meets the eye. But the left hemisphere is simplistic, jumps to conclusions, wants everything black and white, cut and dried.
Right. Now, how do you know this? Because I'm talking to you. I don't know whether my next question to you is going to be from the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, depending how deluded it is. But do you strap people up to things in a machine and see which one's being activated at certain times, or?
You certainly do. But there are many, many, many strands of evidence for this that come from a range of things, from clever experiments, as you say. Mm-hmm. And nowadays we can suppress or enhance one hemisphere at a time using a totally painless technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. But there are also, there's a wealth of literature from people who've had injuries, tumors or strokes in one hemisphere or the other, and what happens to their world. And it's utterly fascinating. I mean, if people really want to know more, I think I've done the sort of most comprehensive digest of this evidence to date.
I just put your books are in the chat now, so if people scroll through the chat, they can press a button and see The Matter of Things, a Master and a Mystery. If there's any more that they should look at, Ian, let us know.
I think those are the two main ones. Yeah.
Those are the two main ones, and we're just before we've got a raft of questions in, which I hope will take our conversation. But I just wanted to boil. We are hearing about mental health problems, particularly amongst the young. This question that I mentioned of self-esteem, is this something that our society could change? Is it because we or parents or need to think differently? How do we resolve it, or how do we get through it?
Yes, okay. Well, I just have to say before we go there that we're glossing over an awful lot of stuff that might give the wrong impression. I mean, most of us, you now, me now, speaking, talking, listening, we're using all of our brains. It's never the case that you're just using one part of your brain. We're all using both parts of the brain all the time. That's really not the point. The point is that when we construct a vision of the world, and that's terribly important, because how we think about the world and ourselves and what we're doing here governs the way in which we live, the things that we pursue, and the sort of belief that we have about ourselves. And it's there, not at the individual level of from minute to minute what's going on in your brain, my brain. That's not the point. The point is that there are two, if you like, conflicting visions of the world. One is a very subtle one. It's almost, if you like, a sacred one, in which things that can't necessarily be seen or measured are very important, in which you can't just isolate something from its context because its context changes it, in which you can't pin something down and take it away and abstract it and think you've got it at last. It's a much more complex world, a nuanced world where nuances matter, where the same utterance can mean two completely different things depending on the way in which it's uttered, the context in which it's uttered, the body language and so on. So we're talking about that against a world which is the reductionist materialist one, which is it's all made up of little bits. These bits are wholly material, they have no meaning, they just bump into one another and then they produce whatever it is, and we make the meaning, we make it all up, we give it a purpose because it hasn't got one, we give it its value because it hasn't got one, and that's the vision that is being sold to us, voiced by some of the sort of vox pop scientists, and is put forward in schools in the way that we're trained in this extremely reduced materialist vision, which I can tell you is just factually wrong, not just philosophically wrong, but we now know from biology is expanded like physics. Physics knew a long time ago that this mechanistic universe, 100 years ago, we knew that this wasn't right. We're now finding in biology that guess what? It certainly doesn't describe life. So these visions are important. And when to go back to what you want to talk about, which is why are we getting so distressed and anxious and sick?
Anxious, yes. You're making me even more anxious, actually, Ian, so I'll have to
yes.
level that out a bit, but please carry on.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that the picture I'm painting is one which does make you feel anxious, because it should do. It's contrary to what your deeper self knows about the world, that it simply can't be simplified in this very kind of noddy-like way into, it's just like this and it works like that in a system just like a machine. So
can you just clarify a couple of things that came out of that?
Yeah.
You said that you talked about the corpus callosum, which is the telegraph in a way between the two hemispheres, and it's got proportionally smaller, not larger, over evolution. So does this mean that during the thousands of years, these two spheres of the brain are communicating less well than they did before?
Well, it's a complex story, but to try and put things in a nutshell, the first thing to realize is that all brains prior to mammals don't have a corpus callosum at all. They have very, very fine, thin connections. But the corpus callosum, which starts with mammals, is a whole step forward in bringing the two together. And originally, it was so that we could pursue something across the midline, so that it was a sort of seamless picture of the world across the midline of vision. But latterly, because our brains have to deal with so much more than any other creatures, we've gone in for specialization. So the left hemisphere and right hemisphere are becoming more specialized. And for that reason, the corpus callosum, which started with mammals, has got proportionately smaller over evolution. So if you look at a dog's brain in cross-section, you'll see its corpus callosum is not much smaller than ours, but its whole brain is very much smaller than ours. And so the corpus callosum's job has become more, it does do a certain amount of, what it always did, which was connecting the two visions. But it's really more about now stopping one kind of thinking, interfering with another. Because if you think about the two ways of looking at the world that I talked about, they are effectively contradictory. I mean, they can be brought together, but as they stand, they look contradictory. And so in a culture like ours, which depends very much on public debate over a very large sphere, not just on, 4 or 5 people talking around a campfire, it's very important to appear to not contradict yourself. The worst thing you can do these days is to be self-contradictory. But actually, it might be a very intelligent thing to do, because it might mean that you're seeing that there are two aspects here, both of which need to be taken into consideration. And our culture is one, no, it's got to be this or it's got to be that, which is in itself a sign of left hemisphere dominance, because it can't bear the idea of more than one complex picture. So what we've got is a world in which all the things that really matter to us, which are the depth of social connection in a community where you share your lives, you trust one another, you work together, you dine together, you worship together. All those things are in every culture before the pre-modern Western one, a very important part of the stability of life. That's number one. It is in itself very fulfilling. The second is closeness to nature. Immersion in nature. And until 1800, 99% of the population of the world would have lived immersed in nature, in the rhythm of the seasons, in spring, the harvest, and so on. And they would be surrounded by nature. Now probably less than half the population of the world is in any way close to real nature.
That
And
is,
the third thing, just to finish off, is a relationship with whatever you like to call it, the sacred, the divine, the higher power, whatever it is. We sense that there is something like that, and when we are told that we must be mistaken and we're not properly grown up if we think things like that, then actually we start to damage ourselves. We attack ourselves, the part of us that intuitively knows these things, that nature is important, that the divine is important, that a properly coherent society is important. And we've now drifted in a world where we're atomized, atomistic, we are severed from nature, and most of us have no religious beliefs or belief in anything much beyond the material.
yeah. No,
And it's
that
therefore
is,
not surprising that we're so bloody miserable.
that encapsulates. I'm going to throw at you and me some of these questions, and the first one from
Sure.
Pauline Blasey throws me out completely. But let's have some short, sharp answers. Pauline Blasey, sounds like you're describing quantum physics.
Well, it was a good point, because quantum physics is much closer to the world I'm describing than Newtonian mechanics.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Geeta says, are men's and women's brains very different?
Well, the devil is in the word very. I mean, they're different. It depends what you mean by very, yes.
Are they hemispherically different? Because we're talking about the two
Yeah, in
hemispheres.
terms of the hemispheres, they are different. The two hemispheres are more specialized in men than in women. So there's more overlap or redundancy, as they say, between the two ways of thinking. So that when a stroke happens in the left or right hemisphere in a woman, it's less clear what will happen than if it happens in a man. We know what will be lost. But in the woman, there is a degree of overlap, or the other hemisphere can supply it if necessary. And I think that's because in terms of evolution, the man was more dispensable, the woman was not, needed to be there for the offspring, and the man needed to be able to think in innovative ways, which is better if the hemispheres are separate. And so, but the fascinating thing is that people think that the left hemisphere must be male and the right hemisphere must be female. And there's there's a lot of evidence on hemisphere differences, and they all point in exactly the opposite direction. So it's testosterone in the womb that causes the right hemisphere to expand. And I could go on, but it's all in the matter with things in my book.
Great question, Geeta. Thank you for that, because my learning curve has gone up a lot with that one. Evelyn Davis, is there a link between the hemispheres and the right and left-handedness?
Well, there is, yes. Unfortunately, no questions about this area are ever, simple cut and dried answers. So let me put it this way: in the customary kind of right-hander, speech is in the left hemisphere in 97% of cases. When there is a left-hander, it's more like 60-40. So it's not as cut and dried. So there are three kinds of left-handers. Once you have, if you like, the same classic distribution of functions that you find in your typical right-hander. The second, which is pretty unusual but does exist, is a complete reversal. So everything that one would normally say right, one now says left. But the more common thing is a mix in which you can't exactly predict what. So things are a bit more, they come into contact with one another in different ways. And this accounts for the fact that left-handers can be found at the top and the bottom of most distributions. So there's a sort of sump of left-handers that are not that as good as right-handers, but there's also a sort of arboreal nest of left-handers up at the top of the tree going, we're doing rather well, thank you.
So, Vivian, I think we've dealt with it, but I'll read it out anyway because you might expand on it. Looking at evolution, have brains pretty much always been hemispherical, or is that a later development of something that was simpler? You did mention it, didn't you? Yes.
Yes, I did, but I didn't clarify that not only every brain that we've looked at is, if you like, hemispherical. I mean, when you've got very simple brains, it's not so much that there's two literal hemispheres, but there are two separate ganglia dealing with different things. So even in extraordinarily simple creatures like the slug, limax, a nematode worm. In these creatures, there is separation of right and left in their very basic neuronal setup. So it does go all the way down, I'm afraid. Yes, there was never a kind of simple, single, unified anything. Just to amuse you, there is a most ancient, extant living creature is a kind of sea anemone that lives off the Isle of Wight. It's 700 million years old, and I sometimes say only marginally raises the age of the occupancy of the Isle of Wight. but it already shows asymmetrical distribution of function. So it is a very, very, very basic thing. It's essential. It's not a Johnny-come-lately, no.
And Maura C, and I think this might move us on to something else I wanted to talk about. What can we learn from our indigenous ancestors and other ancient wisdom traditions? You mentioned that the way our brains function is not evolutionary, it's not even genetic. We can turn them on and turn them off like television channels. So what can we learn from our ancestors?
Well, it depends what you mean by learn from our ancestors. I mean, there's very much we can learn from our own ancestors, to be honest. But yes, I think there is enormous wisdom in the ancient traditions of just about everywhere in the world that you look. So as I say, there are mythologies in pretty much every culture known to man that have, for example, a version of the sorcerer's apprentice myth, which is very, very appropriate to our condition now. You know the story that the apprentice is asked to do work while the sorcerer is out. And he sees the sorcerer utter a spell that makes the broom and the bucket come and do all his work for him. So he listens, and when the sorcerer goes out, he says the words, and everything starts off fine, but he doesn't know how to stop it. Now, this is actually a very good image of the world we're in now. And it seems that long before it actually happened to us as a society, people have worried about what happens if this upstart, the emissary, the apprentice, the whatever, who thinks they know what they're doing but doesn't know what they're doing, if that ever comes to be in control, we will all collapse, our community will collapse. So that is very important kind of wisdom which is universal.
That is fascinating.
And personally, I would say I've learned an enormous amount from particularly far eastern traditions of China, Korea, Japan, India, and so forth, but also from fascinating native North American tribal stories.
Well, because I wanted to move on now, and we're going to come to the other questions in a second, but that moved us naturally on to this. You talk about Japanese or East Asian thinking, and that we in the West have been or do think differently than them. And it's basically that the Japanese culture or the East Asian culture puts the individual within the community more, and we just go for the individual. I know I'm not saying that very well, so just sum that up for us, Iain, will you?
Well, I was told by a friend who was explaining to a Japanese woman what we meant by, you know, a modern Western free individual. And when he described it, she said, "That's sick." And I mean, that is actually very important to realize how very peculiar our idea of autonomy is. And of course, it's a mistake because we're not really autonomous. We're becoming more and more enslaved as we strive more and more to be free of culture, nature, and all the things that are benign determinants of our lives. We rebel against them. And again, you find these stories all over the world. The rebellion against nature ends with destruction. So those are the sort of things that matter. I think you're referring to a bit at the end of the Master and his Emissary, where I look at the, you know, psychologically testable in the lab ways of thinking and seeing. So, for example, looking at a picture, a Westerner typically sees some central thing in the foreground, but doesn't see the rest of the picture. That's very left hemispheric. Whereas if you ask an Eastern Asian person to describe the picture, they may start by describing the background and only then incorporate that there is this figure in the foreground. That's just one example of many, many of a way in which they're more open to the right hemisphere's point of view. But what I would say is that the old sort of hippie era story that the West was left hemisphere and the East was right hemisphere is not quite right. It's better than that. The West is definitely dominated by the left hemisphere in a catastrophic way. We can talk more about that if you want. But the Far Eastern cultures have been able traditionally to balance the two in the way that they should be balanced, so that the left hemisphere has a role, but it has a role which is effectively as the emissary, not the master. It is subordinate to the one that actually sees more, is wiser. But you do need both. You know, people think that sometimes I must think that it would be better if we all had a left hemispherectomy. That's absolutely untrue. I'm very fond of my left hemisphere. I wouldn't be able to talk to you now without it. I sometimes say it's my second favorite hemisphere. So we do need it. The point is that the balance has been lost.
So the balance that we've lost here in the West, is it just that encapsulate that again for us, is that in the Eastern thinking, there is a balance between this partnership that's there. In the West, we've lost that because the individual has become too predominant?
Well, it's not because the individual has become predominant. The emphasis on the individual having to be totally liberated is not a cause. It's a symptom of something that's gone grossly wrong with our society. Of course, freedom is very important. We all want to have a degree of freedom. And as large a degree of freedom as is compatible with a coherent society is desirable. But the pursuit of freedom at the expense of both nature, I think that's very important, and society, that you reject nature because it constrains your possibilities, if only by meaning that you're going to die. And now there are people who literally think they can never die by doing expensive and stupid things. But
when did this trend in our Western society begin? Was it, say, after the Second World War, or was it when social media came in, or you know?
It depends what do you mean by begin. I mean, a lot of people would say it began with the Enlightenment.
Okay.
And some would put it further back to what's called the scientific revolution at the end of the 17th century. And what we're talking about there is the idea that what matters is what can be repeatedly found to be the case and measured in a laboratory. But most of the things that actually matter are not of this kind. And although it's perfectly okay for science to say, well, for our purposes, we're not going to take them into account, that's fine. But then science is not able to say at the end of the day, oh, we discovered there's no purpose and there's no values and so on, because, mate, you ruled them out right at the start. That was your point. You didn't want to deal with them. So you can't say they're not there. You can only say, we failed to find them. And of course, with the Enlightenment, you know, there came the belief that everything can be rationalized, everything can be schematized in a kind of ghastly version of a sort of bureaucratic machine. And that has no place in it for all the things that matter, in imagination, intuition, and so forth.
Okay, I'm going to return to that in a second, but Caroline's question is, I always felt some parts of the brain are not used and that we can use both left and right. We're not just one or the other. I think you've addressed that, but give us a word on that question.
Well, of course, we all use all of our brains all the time, unless there's something wrong with them. So, absolutely. And there was an old complete myth that we don't use more than 10% of our brain or something.
That's a myth, is it? Yeah.
Well, it's not only a myth, it's wrong. I mean...
Pauline Blasey, Funny was listening earlier to a talk about cognitive warfare, which we are under right now. This is like psychological warfare and this sort of thing. And I think that's what Pauline's talking about. This is something that when you talked about the collapse of the Western Empire, as it were, in the Express piece, this is what's going on, isn't it? A bit.
Well, it is. It's true in a number of senses, but I suppose the one that may be in the person's mind is this idea that foreign powers who wish us harm spread misinformation, conflict, doubt, and so forth, because it demoralizes. But we don't need foreign powers to do that, because we're doing it to ourselves and have been for a long time. Probably since before the Second World War, there's been an attack by a group of intellectuals that were not as intelligent as they thought they were on all the important aspects of being human, being able to use your intuition and your imagination, without which you're not that bright. So you do need these things. And we've been attacking our own history. We've been attacking our own culture. And I feel very divided about this, because the good that was in the West it's a shame that we attack it. But the West that attacks the West, which is the last 100 years, is something that is not admirable, and we do need to reverse. So it's not about that we've all got it right, or any other culture has always got it right. That would be very simple-minded indeed. But it is also very simple-minded indeed to just dismiss a very rich and creative culture that also gave the world, in the best sense, the first real political freedoms, but has gone on to destroy what needs to go hand in hand with freedom, which is a sense of knowing where you are, being in touch with reality. But we're knocking that to pieces.
Yes,
as
I
fast
just,
as we
when you
can.
mentioned the Enlightenment, the sort of beginning, and going back hundreds of years, if this was the beginning of this of this trend,
Yes,
it was that trend that created societies that gave us the standard of living and the freedom that we have today. Before that, they were all basically dictatorships, and underneath
yes,
that, you have the developing world, and now you're saying that very same process of the left hemisphere, if that's what it is. But I'm going to give you a couple more questions. Sort of, Geeta, are ADHD and autistic brains very different to other brains?
well, again, it's all about very, isn't it? But autism is very interesting. um, I say that there are autisms rather than autism. I think what one tends to see is most frequently a gross exaggeration of left hemisphere function at the expense of the right hemisphere. So that the right hemisphere enables us, for instance, to understand what another person is thinking, without them necessarily saying it, what they mean when they say something. In other words, a quite subtle living alongside with that person, what it's like to be them. And for somebody with autism, it's very often very difficult to read those things. And they are mystified by, why did he say that? Why did he do that? So it's often like that. But there are people who have, if you like, a sort of an over-specialized right hemisphere in a not particularly healthy way. For example, there's a very famous proponent of autism, a defender, advocate of autism, called Temple Grandin. And she said she was amazed when she heard that people sometimes thought using words. You could only think using pictures, which is much more right hemispheric.
I say, I think,
ADHD, sorry, go on.
no, well, I was moving on to Gordon McKay's question to say, but I think it's sort of come out of this. He's put left hemisphere equals ego, whence emerges empathy, question mark. Empathy is on the right, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
You
And
ask
that,
for snappy answers, I'll give you
well,
snappy answers.
and you actually answered it by talking about autism. Did you want to add a little bit about ADHD?
Well, yeah, both to gloss the empathy thing and the ADHD thing. ADHD is it's becoming commoner, not just because I think we're more alert to it, but I think there really is more of it. And it's because we are constantly subject to stimuli that are designed to hijack our attention, and that we're not able, literally not able. Younger generations it becomes harder and harder for them to sustain attention over any period. And of course, without sustaining attention, it's very hard intelligently to get into something, to understand a book, for example. And so that's another triumph of the left hemisphere. I mean, people sometimes think it might be to do with the right hemisphere, but it's all to do with, I'm afraid all the evidence suggests that it is due to right hemisphere deficits, not left hemisphere deficits.
Okay. And of course, sorry, as a sort of the social media thing. I mean, you and I
Yeah.
are the generation where we had books and posted letters, and we've grown up through this, and my attention has gone down to that of a gnat.
Yeah, look, it happens to us all. But on empathy, it's interesting. There's a version of, if you like, mind reading, which one might call Machiavellianism. And this is what empathy. It's the right hemisphere of the mother and the right hemisphere of the infant communing in the first year of life that enables that child to feel loved and yet to separate from the mother, a very important transition that we all have to go through. So empathy is crucial, and it's mediated in both the mother and the child in the right hemisphere. But the left hemisphere has a version of this, which is, I bet he thinks this, so I'm going to outwit him by doing that. And that's a purely cognitive, it's not at the level of feeling, it's purely like, I can use this to outwit him and perhaps kill him. Whereas the empathy is like, well, I see what it must feel like to be that person.
Catherine Stewart, who I think might be a professional, because can Ian speak to any research or insight about the brain when a human who is menstruating is in the luteal phase? I've heard that in this phase there is more balance with the two hemispheres. This has spoken to some of my experience in this phase. Was looking forward to seeing you in Elgin, but happy to be here today regardless. And thank you for your work, Ian.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. I think if you look, it's not a satisfactory answer, but you will know that the answer is going to be more complex than probably we have time for now. But I deal with that question specifically on, I think it's somewhere between 163 and 167 in The Matter with Things, which is a set of pages with copious footnotes in which I deal with an aside on differences between sexes. And you're quite right, there are differences in phases of menstruation. And so important are they that it has been suggested that when we scan the brains of females, it should be specified which phase of the menstrual cycle they were in, because it makes a big difference.
It's there's a question here that I don't want to ask, but I will, because I said that we would take anything. It comes from self-healing. Can you please speak some neuroscience into what's happening in Palestine? You can answer yes or no.
Well, I think I'd have to say no, really, because, I mean, of course, there's an awful lot one can say, but there's a danger that what one does is become very reductive. And above all, I don't want to be reductive. And people think that because I do very closely connect the mind with the brain, that that is reductive. But it isn't, because I'm not saying that the mind is somehow simply a product of the brain. I believe, in fact, that it can't be a product of the brain, but the brain is important for its expression, transmission, whatever you like to say. So that it's a bit like, if something goes wrong with the TV set, the top of your head is missing, but the top of your head isn't really missing. It's something to do with the TV set. So that's the way of thinking about it, that when the brain is damaged, reality appears to change, but it's not. It's just that that's the way the brain is now dealing with it.
So see, we have. Thank you for addressing that. We have an anonymous, but it's quite interesting and long. We are all Oxford graduates with ADHD, and left brain dominate with, as the psychiatrists and psychologists tell us, we have dyslexia and dyspraxia, which are comorbidites. Fortunately, we do not have ASD, and it goes on a bit. But are you aware of what they are asking, or what the topic is here, Ian, that you could address?
Yes, I am. Once again, I know there's pressure for me to give snappy answers. It's quite a tricky one here.
Well, I'll give you an extra 10 seconds on this one then.
So ADHD, as you say, yes, is a left hemisphere dominant condition. Dyspraxia and dyslexia are often associated with it, it is true, but they're also, there's quite a lot of evidence that they may be to do with left hemisphere deficits as well, or instead. So But that is a long story, and I don't know if Alex Richardson is still, you're in Oxford, if she is still researching. I lost touch with her about 10 years ago, but she did a lot of interesting work on dyslexia and its hemispheric, underlying hemispheric associations.
Right. Okay. And at the end of this question, my brother has many qualifications, including a PhD in maths and engineering, and sorted the Elizabeth line for the Jubilee, which was so wrong. He is lifted and colorblind. So coming back to the left brain dominance, I was ambidextrous and was punished for this at school. So that was that sort of tops and tails set. Joan Hudson says, I've been diagnosed with dystonic tremor. Medication helps to control it. I know that it is caused by my nerves in the brain not sending the correct messages to the muscles. Is this correct?
The cause of a dystonic tremor may be in, as it were, the kind of nerves, motor nerves. Yes, that is possible, but it's more complicated than that because it also involves the autonomic nervous system, which is a wholly separate business. So there are a number of causes of such a thing, and medication is usually able to dampen that tremor. Yes, I'm happy with that.
Okay. Janek, I like this question. Can Ian speak to what educators might do to encourage a more balanced use of the hemispheres, e.g. first-hand experience of nature, gauging in contradictory topics to understand nuance? What should we do, Ian?
Oh,
Not just
absolutely.
educators, all of us.
Yes, no. Well, I think when it comes to education, yes, there are some very obvious things that they're mostly things that need putting back into the curriculum that have been taken out of the curriculum over the last half century. So we desperately need to reinvigorate education with true education. It's not just a matter of putting technical information into children. It's about allowing faculties in them to flourish and to be expressed. And they do this when they best understand the world that they're getting in technical information about. And that comes through humanities. The clue is in the name. It's about understanding humans and their lives and their thinking. And so to be more embedded in literature, to know your Shakespeare, to read poetry, to do music, to learn your history. I mean, to learn other history as well, but it's very important to know the history of your people. To be able to philosophize at a very simple level. In other words, to ask the question, but what if this is not right? And what if I inverted it? What would that show? So I think that, to come to something that was in your question, I think that no child should be able to leave school without having practiced a form of debate in which you argue for a position as strongly as you can, and you then change sides and now argue for the opposite position as strongly as you can, and you'll be rated on how well you're able to argue for the opposite position. So I think that would be a great step forward. I also think that all children should be taught mediation. In other words, how to resolve a dispute, because they're going to find that in the playground, they're going to find it at home, and they're going to find it in their families, and they're going to find it with friends, and it's essential to life, and we've lost it. Now it's all shouting one another down. You're right, I'm right, you're wrong. There's no way I can talk to you because you once talked to X and he's something I don't approve of. This kind of incredibly infantile way of trying to get towards a solution. And the thing about mediation, and the thing about couple therapy, actually, I mean, couple therapy is a very interesting example of something, because in couple therapy, it's very important that each person should have a chance to say something uninterrupted. And so you ask one person to say something, and when they've, the other person starts saying, yeah, but, and they go, no, hang on, you're going to have your chance in a minute. And then when that person's finished talking, the first question to the other person is, what did you just hear that person say? And quite often, the person will say what they think they thought that was being said, and it was quite different. The other person said, that's fascinating, because I never meant that at all. And so you can begin to understand what people are getting at by just being patient and asking questions, rather than rushing in and saying, no, I'm right, it's got to be like this.
And how much does the fear of being proved wrong or the fear of failure uh, threaten or worry our self-esteem on this matter. So you will push through in order to be proved right or in order not to fail. And is this a new thing that's come
No,
out?
not
Or
at all. No, I mean there was always pressure to not necessarily to be proved right, but to do well, to achieve highly. And I think that actually in some ways that's been lost. I'm a believer that children should be held to high standards. I think they enjoy being stretched. I think they become miserable and bored if they're not stretched. So there's nothing wrong with that. And a very important point about self-esteem. There's a man called Roy Baumeister, very well known in the history of psychology, who in the 1980s very much majored on what we need is higher self-esteem. He's now peddling the other position, which is too much self-esteem. and that actually brings us back to the Chinese and Japanese. They don't think that having a high opinion of yourself is a good thing at all. Thinking you're worthless is not good, but we don't have to go to these extremes. This is the ridiculous thing about our culture. If it's not this, it's got to be that. But no, you can have a decent idea that you're pretty good, but you're not the whole thing. And you want to learn more and you want to improve. Now, that's very healthy. But they see that the person who should be valued is the one who helps his or her colleagues, who is socially motivated. And I think that's something we could get back. It's not just about me, 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 me. I mean, if you go that way, you'll get all the sterility and the sadness that comes from narcissism, and you'll be a pain in the neck to everybody that knows you. So instead of going for high self-esteem, let's go for adequate self-esteem and not do ourselves down, but not elevate ourselves over others unnecessarily either.
can I just expand that thought that we've been talking about out really to your Sunday Express piece where you're talking about the collapse of the Western empires and that sort of thing. You're talking about empires. How can we take what you've told us today and put that onto how Russia thinks, China thinks, America thinks, as we're all sort of moving towards this idea of the collapse of the West and the conquest by the authoritarian powers, or however you phrase it?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I should just put in an aside that it's not my piece in the Sunday Express. It's a piece by a journalist, Lucy Johnson, and I take no responsibility for any of the content. But although it's a
you weren't misquoted, were you?
Perfectly nice article. The trouble is, journalism can't go into the nitty-gritty.
Can't do academia.
No, and she was a lovely person, and I'm very grateful to her for the piece she did. I'm just pointing out that don't take that as chapter and verse of what I think. Well, I think all this actually bears very relevantly on the current situation. So, for example, we think that if there is misdirection and disinformation, this comes from enemies overseas, or possibly from so-called right-wing groups. Now, the trouble with the terminology right-wing, left-wing is I think it's completely lost its importance. I think the only differences worth anything nowadays are between people who are strident authoritarians on the left or the right, and those of the rest of us in the middle who are trying desperately to maintain some human balance here, some vestige of common sense. But the point is, I don't think it all comes from overseas and malignant powers and so on. I think a lot of it actually comes from the powers that be in our culture, who I think are very much skewed to a very particular point of view, which is a sort of bien pensant, we're smug, we're better than all those proletarians and sort of working class people who are probably yobs and Brexiteers, and so there's a terrific snobbery, and it only allows you to have a range of opinions which are approved by this sterile bunch of people with their sort of, if you say that, it's banned, and you can't ask that question, no. And I think that's very, very damaging. It comes back to Hannah Arendt, who survived the Nazis, said, and wrote so brilliantly about totalitarianism, that you are in a tyranny when there are things that can't be asked, and there are many things that can't now be asked. So I think all this plays into a situation in which so-called populist movements are very much feared. But these populist movements are a response to being absolutely ignored, all their values neglected, all their concerns dismissed, and being told that they're stupid for thinking the way they do. And I think there will be a big backlash, and Trump is part of that. I don't blame Americans for electing him. I'm saying nothing of his moral character, and I'm not saying that he's going to be good for the world in lots and lots of respects. But I can see why he got elected, because he want only somebody perhaps as sort of slightly crass, as he is, not interested in the nuances, but able to go in there and go, no, it's like this. But actually, at this stage, we've had governments, so-called left-leaning and right-leaning, pussyfooting around for about 30, 40 years, where the world goes to hell in the handcart, none of them with any new policies, and everything becoming more corporate, more global. It's all the EU, it's the WEF, it's Google, it's, but actually, we, the citizens of countries, we're no longer consulted, and we have no redress against these global bodies. And this is why we're getting a resurgence of nationalism.
And of course, I mean, in these discussions, what is often sort of over is that he was democratically elected. So you can call
yes,
him
excuse me. Yes, he was,
but he was democratically elected through the. I want to return to the medical side of this, because Miguel Leith says, have you noticed any differences in how the left hemisphere and right hemisphere of the brain behave in people with schizophrenia?
Oh, very much so, yes. I mean, to give you a short answer, and I'm sorry if you're a fellow neuroscientist or neurologist or psychiatrist, but my simple answer is that the best way to think of the schizophrenic brain is that it is like the left hemisphere on steroids, with the right hemisphere not functioning properly at all. So it's rather like having, if you wanted to take a human brain that's functioning well and turn it into something like a schizophrenic brain, you'd put a lot of holes in it, but mainly in the right hemisphere. And I actually, interestingly on this, I'll just comment this. I spent some time at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore imaging the brains of people with schizophrenia and looking at asymmetries in the brain. And the interesting thing is that normal brain is asymmetric. It has this expansion posteriorly on the left and an expansion anteriorly, towards the front in other words, on the right. And in medical school, we only ever heard about the bit on the left because it was said to be to do with language, and that's not necessarily true. It didn't evolve because of that, although now it does underwrite aspects of language. But to cut to the chase, people with schizophrenia often have reversed asymmetry, so the bits that should be enlarged are not, and the bits that shouldn't be enlarged are. Or they may have lost the normal symmetry and just have totally symmetrical brains. And that means that a lot of the really important areas for understanding the world, so-called heteromodal association cortex, which is in areas like the anterior cingulate, the planum temporale, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Sorry, just in case this is of more technical interest to you, these are the areas that are affected by this reversal of asymmetry, and these are the areas that give rise to, or should be giving rise to, clearer thinking, clearer speech, and so forth.
Thank you. And I just want to say to bring in Amber's thing here. It doesn't need a response because Times Wing Charity is attacking us. I find many people are not listening to what you are actually saying, but think you are saying something else. I think that was sort of put the money on one of the things you described. But as I mentioned, Time's winged chariot is attacking us. We are almost out of time. If you've enjoyed this pioneering hybrid show with experts and civilians with such a brilliant guest as Ian, let us know and we'll put on more. Now, just before we go, Ian, I know that everything's a long answer and more complicated, but give us a final thought about what we've learned and how we should adopt a new way. Should we turn to different channels in our two spheres?
I think what we should do is question all the things that we think we know. So it's always appropriate to say this may be right, but it may not be, and what would happen if it were wrong? So that's one good thing we can do. Another is to become aware of what it is we don't know. We think we know certain things, but the more intelligent you are, the more you realize how little you know. And the more unintelligent you are, the more you think you know it all. So a very good exercise is to is to invoke wonder. And one way to do this is to listen to wonderful music, to read the great works of literature, and to go out in nature and just be peaceful for half an hour, a few times a week. Switch off your phone completely. Don't be thinking about other things, but actually be in the presence of nature and see how miraculous it is.
Thank you so much for that. We are getting a stream of questions in and comments in saying, thank you so much for this. It is fascinating. Please, let's do more. We will, I hope, and thank you everyone for being here. And thank you for your challenging comments and questions, which I think we picked up okay, but tell us if we didn't. And thank you, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, for fielding everything that has been hurled at you. Great having you.
Thank you very much. Can I just say, I haven't been able to read the messages. I see lots of interesting ones. Is it possible to save the chat and send it to me, please?
Ben is our guru, and yes, he's so technical. He's put a thumbs up there, so we will send you all of the
Fabulous.
chat.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I thought we'd got 2 hours. I therefore was expatiating, but there we are. Thank you very much. It's been lovely, and perhaps another time. Yes.
Well, we will have you back by popular demand, Ian, if we can do it. And everybody keep an eye on the Care Visions website for our next event. We will ask Ian back because there's so many things saying they could have listened to you for hours and days. But thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye.